Grace and peace to you in the name of God the Creator, Christ the Redeemer, and the Spirit who sustains us. Amen. During my middle school years, 4th through the beginning of 8th grade, my family lived in a parsonage in rural northeast Kansas. We were 5 miles outside a town of 200 and about 15 miles away from the county seat, a town of about 4,000. Our nearest neighbors were about a quarter of a mile away. If you stood looking out our front door, the church was to the right of our house. There was a pasture behind and to the left of us, and across the road, there was a small garden plot where the previous pastor had started an asparagus patch. Beyond the asparagus, soybeans to the horizon. My closest friends were the children of farmers or farmhands. I remember one summer when a friend dared me to touch the electric fence, but she did warn me only to touch it with one hand. I did it, and then, pun intended, I was shocked that if I could touch it with my bare hand, it would keep cattle from crossing from the pasture into the field. That same friend's family had a four-wheeler. One winter after it snowed, her dad hooked their toboggan behind the four-wheeler and took us for a ride in a field that had been plowed under for the winter. The way the sled bounced on the terraces was pretty exciting and more than a little scary. I remember asking him one time about the terraces, and he explained that the land was carved into these shapes to help prevent soil erosion. I thought it would make farming more difficult, but he explained that it was actually beneficial to the fields and the crops, and therefore to the farmers. We saw a lot of winter wheat, soybeans, and corn in our area, along with cattle and some hogs. I wasn't old enough or experienced enough with the world to know how financially tight things could be for farmers, how much they might rely on things like crop insurance and subsidies. I didn't know enough history to understand why the Dust Bowl in the 1930s drove as many farmers off their land and away from their homesteads as it did. When we went out on evening walks or bike rides, we would see homes that had been abandoned for decades. Beautiful old homes long since left to rot, roofs fallen in, doors gone, no glass in the windows. Every once in a while, and only if my dad was around, a group of us might go exploring in one. We might even be able to stand in the living room and look up through the ceiling to the bedroom above, straight through the roof to the sky. I wondered sometimes what happened to the people who had built those homes. Wondered if their kids had grown up and moved away and they had died. At 13 or 14 years old, it never occurred to me to wonder if they just couldn't afford to keep farming. If some of them might have given up on land that had been in their families for generations. Today, over 80% of Americans live in cities or the suburbs surrounding them. But although that feels normal to us today, over the course of human history, it's actually profoundly abnormal. There's been a massive shift over the last 230 years. In 1790, only 5% of Americans lived in urban areas. And over the years of increased urbanization, we who live in urban areas have felt increasingly disconnected from the land, increasingly disconnected from the trees and the plants that grow on it, from the animals that feed from its bounty, increasingly disconnected from the creation of which we are a part. That makes it hard for those of us who aren't intimately connected with the land to know what to do with a biblical text that calls for the land to lie fallow 1 year out of every 7. so that the land itself can have a Sabbath to be renewed and restored. The algorithms on social media are funny things. By and large, they feed you more of what you consume, and lately it seems like that means I see less content from people I actually know and more content from people that social media thinks I ought to care about. Usually the algorithms are wrong, and I don't have much interest at all in the content that I'm being shown. But every once in a while, I see something that really gets me thinking. I saw one of those posts a couple of weeks ago. I wish I could remember exactly what it said or even who posted it, but it was something like, our priorities need to be planet, family, economy, not economy, family, planet. There was no context, and you know how that drives me crazy. But what I took from the post is that conventional wisdom in the business world is that we can dig ourselves out of the environmental crisis through better economic policies, and the poster disagreed with that conventional wisdom. So I went looking for more information about that concept. It took a couple of tries, but I found an interesting article called Time for Degrowth. To save the planet, we must shrink the economy. It was written in 2016 by Jason Hickel, a lecturer at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and appears in the online journal, The Conversation. In the first sentence of his article, Hickel references the UN's 17 Sustainable Development Goals. These goals are amazing and lofty. They range from no poverty or hunger to reduced inequalities, to better education, to sustainable energy and economic growth for everyone, everywhere. Do these goals sound at all like anything we've been talking about over the last few weeks? Hickel likes the fact that the UN is dreaming big, but he criticizes how they plan to get there. The UN is calling for a 7% growth in GDP for less developed countries, and even more for more developed countries such as the US. According to the UN, the environmental sustainability of their plan comes into play through increased efficiencies. GDP stands for gross domestic product, by the way, and it is a financial measure of the market value of all the goods that have been created by a country within a given period of time. Here's the problem with that. Hickel says that we are currently overproducing the planet's resources by 60% a year. In 5 years from now, we, the producers of the global economy, will be creating over 100 million tons of things every year. In 75 years, if we don't change our course, we, the producers and the consumers of the global economy, will be generating 3 times as much solid waste as we were in 2016. There aren't many things that we consume that don't come from the earth or end up in the earth or both. 60% of the cobalt that is used in cell phone batteries, for example, is mined in Congo. And according to the Ocean Conservancy, 11 million metric tons of plastic ends up in the ocean every year. And that's to say nothing of the plastics that end up in landfills. That's an awful lot of work the land has to do, to give up its stores of heavy metals and other precious things so that we can carry our computers in our pockets or purses, to have its oceans and waterways polluted with plastics that endanger wildlife and plants. And that's in addition to the rapid conversion of its population from rural forest or farmland to concrete jungles over the last 2 centuries as it tries to continue to feed us and all life. When will it get a break? When will we get a break? The world keeps moving at a breakneck speed, and it feels like we keep tap dancing as fast as we can to keep up with it. We do everything we can to keep up, to get ahead, to pay off our debts. Meanwhile, the economy keeps rolling. The gap keeps growing between poor and rich, between the ones who have to borrow to make ends meet and the ones who can afford to give a loan. But that does nothing to address the imbalance. It does nothing to address the growing disparity between the ones who have it all and the ones who must borrow for almost everything they have. The statute in Leviticus for the Jubilee year was not unique in the ancient Near East. There were other kingdoms where when a new ruler came to power, he would cancel debts and order the return of forfeited property. But it was typically limited to the king's retainers, but it did serve a purpose. It kept the economy from collapsing under the weight of its own debt. What was unique about the Israelite year of Jubilee was that it wasn't meant to be dependent on the whim of the ruler to make it happen. It was meant to prevent the gap between rich and poor from growing too wide, meant to instill a basic form of economic justice into people's dealings with each other, but also with the immigrants who lived and worked in their midst. Now, there's no conclusive evidence that the Jubilee year was ever actually observed among the Israelites. But what's really amazing is that unlike some ideas that seem too good to be true, that catch people's imagination and just as quickly fade from memory, the idea of the Jubilee year has stayed with us. Almost 1,500 years after Leviticus was written, Jesus quotes from the book of Isaiah during his first ever sermon, proclaiming that the time has come for liberation, healing, and economic justice. And 2,000 years later, we still hold on to this hope for God's creation, that somehow we will find a way to reach this promise of Sabbath recovery for the land and economic justice and liberation for its people. How do we get there? Hickel suggests degrowth, slowing our consumption of resources on a global scale, allowing GDPs to shrink in many countries, even while poorer countries continue to advance. He also suggests using factors other than GDP to track our progress, such as well-being, education, longevity, and health. Maybe if we do that, we can put God's creation and our neighbors ahead of our economic growth. If that doesn't sound like a good start to a year of Jubilee, I don't know what does. Count me in. When can we start? Amen.